Welcome to the Happy Mama Movement podcast. I'm Amy Taylor-Kabbaz, mama, journalist, coach, and founder of Mama Rising. This podcast is a space of community and collaboration. We gather stories of matrescence, motherhood, womanhood, and change told by our Mama Rising coaches and mothers around the globe, in the knowing that through our stories, we can begin to heal and change the way the world sees, values, and supports mothers everywhere. So, welcome to the Happy Mama Movement.
Welcome back, everybody. I have such a treat for you today. As many of you know, I have been talking about motherhood and the transition into motherhood for over 15 years. Talking about matrescence for about 7 or 8, I think it is. In that time, there have been just a few women around the world who I feel like was doing exactly the same thing on the other side of the world at the same time, asking questions like I was, creating programs for mamas and learning with them, then eventually becoming a voice for matrescence and motherhood and change that we really need to see. As I said, there's just a few of us who have been doing this for this long, and Jessie Harrold is one of them. Jessie lives on the other side of the world from me, but I feel like we have been doing this together. She too has been coaching women and supporting mothers for over 15 years as a doula and a coach and a space holder and a trainer. She created the internationally acclaimed program for mothers called Mothershift, and also a sister program for postpartum professionals called The Village. Like I said, this is my soul sister. And in November this year, her book, Mothershift, is going to be published and released. We caught up for the first time in a few years in this interview, and as you'll hear, had a ball talking about matrescence theory, culture, society, our personal experience of motherhood and supporting so many mothers, and really the beautiful opportunity that the world has right now to do this differently, and how you as a mother can really honor this time in your life and the growth and the grief that comes with it. I know you'll get so much out of Jessie. Enjoy. Hi, Jessie. Welcome to the podcast, my fellow matrescence activist.
Yay. Hi, Amy. It's so good to be back.
For those of you who don't know the phenomenal Jessie Harrold, we were trying to remember, I think maybe it was 2019 was the last time you were on my podcast. I don't even think it was called the Happy Mama Movement back then. It had a different name because I've had 2 different podcasts. In other words, we have been in each other's worlds, admiring each other's work from other sides of the world for a really, really long time. Can you just remind us, if people do know who you are, but if they don't, how you came to discover matrescence and what it did to you when you found it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been a doula for 17 years now. I just did the count recently. And so I've been in the world of birth and mother support for that long. And I entered that world before I became a mother myself. And I think it was an interesting way to do that because a lot of the questions that people have as they're birthing are ones that I didn't necessarily have. What I was really interested in was what was going to happen to me afterwards, right? And to my sense of self and my identity. Those were the questions I went into motherhood with. And I happened to have a doula who was talking about matrescence in her own way back then, 13 years ago now it was, that I finally did become a mother myself. And I chose my doula because she had given a talk for a bunch of birth workers um, previous to me getting pregnant. And she said the transition to motherhood takes 2 to 3 years. And I had never heard such a thing in my life. This was 13 years ago. This is before we had the word matrescence in our lexicon. It certainly existed, as we know, but it wasn't being widely used. And so I had this amazing mentor who primed me for understanding this rite of passage in a different way than I think most people were at that time and are now.
Mm.
And so that's kind of where it started. And and sure enough, yeah, my world got rocked just like everyone's world gets rocked in motherhood. And I kind of followed that thread and got really interested in the transition to motherhood. And so again, I started teaching a program for new mothers before we had the word matrescence. It was almost 10 years ago that I started my transition to motherhood program,
Mm-hmm.
which now has a jazzier name because because we have a word. But yeah, so that's how I got into this work. It's been a long time. And it's been really interesting to see that now be reflected in the zeitgeist in a different way.
Yes, we were talking about this just before we hit record that, you and I have been in this space for about the same amount of time. My eldest daughter is nearly 17, which is mind blowing. But really, it was about 10, 12 years ago that I started to ask these questions in a more cohesive way and then discover what matrescence was. And we've both sort of really seen this wave of acknowledgement, of popularity, of recognition of matrescence
Mm.
spreading around the world in a really exciting way. It feels like, I don't know if you feel like this, Jessie, but it feels like the wave is sort of building. It's like the momentum
Mhm.
is coming around this word, and it's so
Mhm.
exciting, especially when I started trying to talk about this a decade ago. I didn't even know how to articulate what I was trying to talk about, let alone I didn't even know what the word was yet. But if somebody
Yeah.
said to me, "Oh, what do you do?" I couldn't even put it into words what we do. And it's such a different landscape now.
Mhm. Yeah, it
It-
really, really is. It's been really cool and validating and fascinating. You're right. When I first started offering my program, I think like the first couple of years, people were kind of like, but why would you need support with that?
oh my gosh, yes.
Right? And it
Yeah.
was very much like not recognized as a thing.
Mm.
Um, Yeah, so it's really cool that you're right. We have a wave of awareness now in our culture of matrescence. And I think as we were talking before we press record, now we're ready for the next steps, right?
That's right. Exactly. So now we know what it is, but we want it to be more than a hashtag. We want it to be more than a word that we hear and see. And I mean, Google still doesn't recognize it as a word yet. Although I am
Mhm.
in conversations with Google about doing some matrescence training there. So hopefully that will kick things off there. So we've got a long
Excellent.
way to go. We have so long to go. But I'd love to hear your thoughts because you've been in this space and it's so exciting to me to talk to somebody who's been in this space and really focused on the identity shift of a woman as she becomes a mother for as long as I have. When we think about uh, how we're going to go from knowledge to practice, knowledge
Mhm.
to change. I am 100% usually a glass half full kind of girl,
Mhm.
but I feel like we are still at the beginning of the mountain that we need to climb. The word is beginning to be out there. And like I've said a couple of times, that's so exciting and a huge change from just a few years ago. But then when I
Mhm.
look at the core changes that are going to be required, the cultural shift, the policy shift, the
Yeah.
societal changes that we're needing to really acknowledge this transition differently,
Yeah.
I do get a bit weary and a bit tired
Mm.
at times because I look ahead and I'm like, wow, that's a bloody big mountain we're climbing here. How do you
Mhm.
feel about it today?
Yeah. there's so much here. um, there's kind of like this individual micro level of depth of understanding. And you're right. Like I've always said, and the reason why I wrote my book is that we have awareness. We know that matrescence is a thing. And I say that actually from the perspective of someone who works in this field. Really, we don't know that matrescence is a thing. So the awareness is still certainly necessary, you're right about the Google thing. And my publisher didn't want to put matrescence in the title of my book because they thought no one would know what it was.
Yep.
Yeah, totally. And that's now. And I was like trying to convince them, really, we do know, but we don't know. And so I think there's still the awareness piece, but I think we're ready for depth.
Yes.
And to kind of go beyond the that it happens. And my work specifically with, but at that micro level, I guess, is the how it happens. So we know that it happens. How does it happen? What is the kind of trajectory of the experience? And we know a bit from rites of passage theory, and kind of life transition theory. But if we look deeply at that evidence, it's actually generally been created by, for, and about old white guys. It's largely culturally appropriated. It's very patriarchal. It's linear. It's context free, really. And so that was my work with this book, was to kind of dive into that depth, that how does matrescence unfold? And to me, that was my particular way of approaching this. How do we bring this awareness into praxis, right? And what do we do about this word that we now know or don't know? And so I think that's important. And I think that we're also understanding things at that individual level in a lot of different and important ways. We've got more brain research being done, neuroscience being done at sort of the physiology and the hormonal shifts that go well beyond that fourth trimester. And, we've got some really cool research being done on like ecopsychology and matrescence and all of these really neat intersections that help us to get that depth at the individual level. And, I think back to, you'll remember this was like well within the span of time that we've been working on this, the explosion of our awareness of the fourth trimester.
Yes.
Like when I started doing birth work, it was, 6 weeks as a doula, I'd follow up with people and breastfeeding was going fine. Okay. And, you were mostly feeling healed-ish. Okay, great. We're done here, And so that was an explosion of awareness and then praxis. And so I do have confidence that, we can increase the depth of our awareness and understanding and praxis around matrescence. You're right. There's that macro collective level that we're still grappling with. And I want to say, in my experience, it's been probably only in the last 4 or 5 years that we've been talking about kind of the wider social context within which mothers are becoming mothers.
Very
right.
true.
And so, right. And that was something that I started writing this book 5 years ago. That was like a big thing when I first started. It was like, as a birth worker, I'm seeing the ways in which mothers' matrescence is being impacted by, industrialized birth. I'm seeing how their matrescence is being impacted by the lack of maternity leave in so many countries, by lack of affordable childcare, and so many other kind of policy level and wider kind of cultural level shifts that need to be made that inevitably play a role in how, I'm going to say, like, how well we traverse our matrescence or how well we are in this process. I mean, I think it's going to happen anyways, right? Matrescence is something that happens when you have a baby.
And
But
you
I
can't
think, like,
avoid it.
you're right. Exactly. but the thing is I think matrescence is filled with potential, as you and I both
Mm.
agree. It's filled with potential, but that potential isn't necessarily actualized when we're not supported, when we're not, validated and recognized in our experience, when we literally don't have the social and cultural supports to kind of uncover who we're becoming as mothers.
Yes. I
Yes.
love the way you talk about this. Oh my gosh, we could just create a whole program together and talk for days and days. There's so many things I'd love to pick out here, but what I love what you're saying, first of all, is that there is these two different levels of change, two different levels of support we need to look at: the micro or the individual experience of becoming a mother, and then the world we mother in. And as you were speaking just then, it's become really clear to me again that I think the zeitgeist is changing. I think so much is happening around this for mothers at the moment because it's going hand in hand with so many other changes that we're finally acknowledging in our world.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
goes hand in hand with Me Too. It goes hand in hand with the post-COVID burnout from mothers around the
Yeah.
world who are literally finally saying, hell no, we are not going
Yeah.
to be doing it this way anymore. It's like, it gives me goosebumps saying it like this.
Mhm.
There's, yes, this is happening in the motherhood space, but it's happening in a lot of different spaces. And
Yes.
it's like they're building this momentum together. And as everyone who's listened to my podcast for a long time will know, I deeply believe that understanding matrescence has the potential to change the world.
Mhm.
Because when you start
Mhm.
looking at how we support mothers through this experience, it flows into everything. It flows onto the care economy, how we look after our children, how we look after our planet, how we look after our elderly. We challenge the patriarchy. We stop looking at things that as linear. There's it. It's happening now because there is so much rumbling under the surface.
Yeah, I think I agree. Like, I think of mothering and motherhood as being fundamentally counterculture, and I think,
Love
um,
that.
yeah, I mean, I often think about the people our culture leaves behind, like the people who can't keep up
Oh,
and who can't keep up with capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy. And mothers are among them, alongside many others who hold marginalized identities. Um, and I think that we're growing in numbers, mothers and others who are this culture is not set up for us to thrive.
yeah.
And so so much of our culture has asked us to deny the fact of our motherhood in order to participate in capitalist patriarchal white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us are able to do that, but most of us, I think, really struggle. And so you're right. I think more and more of us are struggling. I wish we weren't, but at the same time, our voice against those oppressive powers is growing. And we're starting to recognize in the ways in which our culture is dehumanizing.
Mm.
And I think at the same time, one of the things that I've been really interested in is kind of intersecting what we know about matrescence with what we know about adult development psychology. And there's a lot of different theories as to how adults develop and grow and mature. We also go through milestones just like our children do. Um, and a lot of the milestones of adult development are things that I see mothers learning how to do in sort of like an accelerated way as they move into motherhood. So things like being able to hold paradox and complexity. You mentioned like interdependence and understanding what it is to put someone else before you, which is yes, it's a slippery slope, but it's also how we move from this hyper individualistic culture into one of villageness, the village. Um, there's a number of other things, being able to insource our wisdom rather than outsource our wisdom. Like there's a lot of potential that's available to us as we grow and develop through matrescence. And in the book, I also talk about these kind of counterculture skills and capacities that I call the mother powers. And again, they're things that support us in our motherhood and in our individual kind of ways. So they're things like embodiment and inner knowing and creativity and community and ritual and earth connection and all of these things that, yes, can help us mother well and help us tend to ourselves and grow as mothers, but they're also kind of exactly what our world needs right now.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, so I'm excited to point to those things as areas of potential in matrescence, because I think, yeah, it's not just like sort of the way that we're able to kind of speak to the powers that be about how difficult life is in our culture for so many of us, but it's also about learning the skills and capacities that our culture needs more of. So almost modeling what change could look like. And that's what gets me pretty excited.
Same. And I remember when I first really started studying matrescence with Dr. Aurelie Athen years ago, and she pointed out to me, when you look at the real change movements throughout history, Black Lives Matters, the women's movement, so many different changes that we've been through in history, in recent history, it's always been the ones that have been most oppressed and affected that have created the change. It's always been the ones that were living it every single day that finally rose up and said no more. Again, goosebumps. That is what I feel is going to happen with mothers. And thanks to social media, that's what's happening quicker and quicker. Like you and I both have spoken about, like when I became a mum 17 years ago, I wasn't even on Facebook. So when I asked these questions and looked around, nobody else was saying anything. Whereas now, if you ask this question, you realize there's voices all around the world talking about this, and therefore you can use your voice. Like that is such a huge change in a matter of a decade to think about how much more power. I remember when my book came out, I did a lot of talkback radio here in Australia with the ABC, because I used to be with the ABC. So I got lots of media opportunities on the ABC. And I remember this older gentleman, we'll call him, called in and really had a go at me live on air. Which didn't bother me at all, because I'd done that job for 15 years. I was used to those types of people calling in and challenging and showing their true colours, let's say. Anyway, and he said to me, "What a selfish generation you are, to be thinking about your experience and what happened to me and where did I go and what about me. Do you think that my mother, who mothered in the 50s and sent 2 of her sons to war, and only one of them came back and never did anything outside of the house, but did it with strength and resilience, do you think she was in the kitchen asking herself, what about me? Where did my identity go? How did I change?" And it was a really confronting moment, even though, it didn't surprise me that came out, because it has been a question that's come up a lot over my career of talking about mothers. Like, what do you think that this is something that, isn't this just a modern problem? You're all asking yourself, but what about my identity and what about me? I'd love to talk to you about that for a moment and what your thoughts are on that, and not necessarily what you would have said to him in that moment, but if you want to answer that, you can as well.
I have thoughts.
How do you answer the question of, is this just the social media generation, which is all, what about me, and sort of a shift in focus back to us, and that's not what this should be?
Right. Oh, there's so many places to go with this. Let me start and we'll see what happens. Yeah. I think that in a way, he's right. Like, no, we didn't have the privilege to question our own motherhood. It was never something you were allowed to question
Exactly.
back then. So I think yes. And I also think what you're saying about like, is this just a, our generation or social media influences or things like this? I do posit, and people argue with me, but I like this argument. I do posit that I think it's harder to become a mother now than it has ever been in our history. And no, I don't know what it was like to have to put up enough jam for the winter, and make sure my kids were clothed from our hand woven, woolens. No, but I think for a number of different contextual reasons, some of which I've already mentioned, the way that we come into motherhood, we've got about a 30% of mothers report having birth trauma, and a good portion of those coming into motherhood with PTSD. We've got, yes, that lack of social policy. We've got social media is a huge, it has benefits, but it has a lot of drawbacks. There's a whole kind of confluence of things that are happening right now in our culture that make matrescence in modern days quite a particular experience.
Yeah.
And tough. And the other thing that's interesting, you talk about the like power and motherhood and how we wield power and how mothering and motherhood can be a source of power. This is an old story, right? So back in the kind of early to mid 1900s, we had this movement called maternalism. And maternalism was all about mothers are powerful because they are raising the next generation. And so they're the moral compasses of our society. They should be in leadership roles and in, positions of power, because there's something about motherhood that makes us special, because we're raising these children. And it kind of erases the subjectivity of the mother for sure, because it's just about raising upstanding children. But so that's what maternalism said. So mothers should have power because they're raising the next generation. Then we kind of swung the other way in our like second wave feminism era into what was called momism. And momism said, no, everyone and every woman can hold power. Doesn't matter if you're a mother. You don't have to be a mother to have these particular skills and capacities. But what happened as a result of momism is that we kind of, flipped the script and said that, well, mothering doesn't actually make you particularly interesting or different or skilled in any way at all. And neither of those things is very true, right?
Yes.
Neither of those things are true. But that has been this conversation, this pendulum swing of the conversation around mothers and power. And so I always want to, I want to talk about this more, because when we say that matrescence can be empowering, and when we say that mothers have this capacity to make change and to speak truth to power, I think we need to be mindful of how we wield that power, and that we don't repeat the past. That there's some kind of a middle ground there. And I think, Dr. Andrew O'Reilly has found that middle ground in talking about matricentric feminism, that mothering can be an individual, private practice and praxis, and it can make us activists and advocates for a better world. And both are true, but neither are necessary. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't kind of saddle mothers with this kind of third shift of activism and advocacy, because God knows, I think like oftentimes the question underneath the question of how do we wield our power and how is mothering empowering is that currently it is inherently disempowering in many ways, and nobody has the friggin' time and energy for that, right? So there's this paradox, right? That we have this potential to make change, and we're friggin' tired.
Yeah. Like I said before, when you look at all the great movements of change, it started with those that are most oppressed. It's exactly the same. And I've had women in my programs and mamas in my community say, oh, great. So if I want change, I'm going to have to do it. And it, you sort of feel like saying, yeah, probably. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
But don't feel like you need to do it today. I feel like
Yeah.
that is also the job of, where the stage of matrescence and motherhood I'm at now, where my children are older. Although I have to say, there are days where I think this is actually harder than when they were
Oh my
toddlers.
God.
But there is this sense of moving into a more elder activist role right now, because there was no way in hell I was going to be able to do this when I had 3 under 5. Or so there is these acknowledgements of, yeah, it probably is going to be us that will create the change we most need to see, but we won't do it individually, we'll do it collectively. And it's okay to take a moment and do this as an individual first, and then turn your eye towards the system and culture and change that we want to see. I wanted to add one more thing about those mothers back in the day and the different experience of matrescence that we have now. There's some really amazing work by an academic researcher here in Australia, Kathy Pascoe, who she studied both the stories and media and articles around motherhood and interviewed generations of mothers in Australia to see what their experience was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way up until now.
Yeah.
And one of the things that she said, I did a podcast interview with her, we'll pop it in the show notes, that I really resonated with, which also speaks to what you were saying about it is harder now in many ways. She spoke about how there was no other identity to become as a woman in the 40s and 50s and earlier. You were born a girl. It was assumed you would do this. And therefore, yes, there was a shift of identity inside of you. Yes, those cascade of changes that you experienced in matrescence was absolutely there. But she often, and we're generalizing here, wouldn't have questioned or felt anything else because that was assumed. Whereas our generation, we're grown up to be told to do everything but be a mother. And so there's that massive identity gap or shift that might not have been there or has been so huge and wide and destabilizing back in the day. And the final thing she said that I loved was that therefore there was a sense of power and becoming who you were meant to be.
Yeah.
In becoming a mother back then, that I am fulfilling my purpose. I am doing what I am meant to be doing in our culture. And there was a power and a pride in that we have lost in today's modern motherhood. And when she was explaining it that way, I was like, yeah, if I'd known that back then to that talkback guy, I would have said something along those lines. I didn't know it then. But I think that's a really important clarification there as well, that we're not told or prepared or given this identity with such reverence and power and pride. But when we become it, we feel that within ourselves, but it's a split from what we thought we would be doing or how we thought we would be feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, well, our generation is the generation that was told that we could be anything, right? We have like 250 different Barbies with 250 different professions, right?
Exactly.
And but what happened there was that the only way that you could be anything, and this is still true in our culture, was by it was really a binary choice. You could be a mother or you could be anything, because that sort of second wave feminist movement that like allowed us the opportunity to say and believe and know that we could be anything didn't value motherhood in the same way and didn't set up the infrastructure, the social infrastructure that was needed to make quote unquote everything possible.
Exactly.
Or anything possible, right? And so, my mother's generation and our generation, again, have been asked to kind of deny the fact of their motherhood if they wanted to pursue just about anything else, just about any other aspect of their identity. And so I think it's a great point. And I think like we've been offered all of this opportunity, supposedly, But and this mostly, I think this happens often as a surprise to new mothers who continue to be told that they can be and do anything. And then they become mothers and realize how impossible that is, and how actually the request is not that you can do anything, but that you have to do everything.
Oh,
Um,
bingo.
right. Yeah. And I think, well, there's a whole other conversation here, I think, where we're perpetuating that by deifying the mothers who do everything, or at least appear to be doing everything. And we have this rhetoric of how strong and resilient and capable mothers are because they can do everything. And I think we have to speak up against that as well and say, actually, I'm not doing everything at all, not doing well at any of it, not thriving.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, that is one of the next steps we need to be taking. And I think we're starting to. I think, again, in social media, I think there is a beginning of an acknowledgement that it's not as pretty as it looks on Instagram.
Mhm.
We could talk for days, like I said, but perhaps
Yeah.
let's finish our conversation with, I mean, I've absolutely adored how macro and culture and societal we've gone with this conversation. This is so much my happy place. But if we
Mhm.
were to finish by coming back to the individual mama who's listening to this conversation
Mhm.
and whose world is probably still sort of blown a little bit by realizing, oh my gosh, there's something called matrescence and this is what I'm going through. Where do I
Mhm.
start?
Mhm.
So, in your book, I know you've got your process to move through this rite of passage.
Mhm.
If you could speak to her for a moment,
Yeah.
where does she begin today? How can she begin to support herself through this huge mother shift, as the name of your book is
Mhm.
called, within this cultural context that we've just talked about?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that I always support mothers with is it's actually not the kind of first phase of a rite of passage that we normally think of. I call it earth. And it's essentially, it's orienting to the changes that have happened in your life. It's literally as simple as naming the change.
Yes.
Um, Getting real with what's happened. So, our lives are ecosystems, and the nature of matrescence is that it shifts the entire ecosystem of our lives. So it's not just that you're changing diapers right now and learning how to make really strong coffee. It's your intimate partnership has probably changed. Your relationship with your mother has probably changed. Your community, your friends, your body, your, relationship to the place you live, perhaps, certainly your career, like the whole gamut is changing. And I think a lot of mothers in those very early phases, as you describe, um, they kind of are just overwhelmed by it. Like,
Mm.
everything has changed. Oh my God. So I think it's helpful to name it, to just say, yeah, my marriage doesn't feel quite like it did, or I feel disoriented in my body, or I don't know if I can go back to that job, and name it. And then I guess I'll move like a little bit into the next piece that I think is really important without taking up too much time. But um the thing that we're missing in our conversation around all rites of passage and life transitions, but matrescence and motherhood especially, is that when everything changes and when you are no longer the person you were, you need to grieve that loss. And you
Yes.
need yeah. And that takes the time it takes. And I think we don't have the skills as a culture to know how to do that. There's privilege associated with being able to grieve motherhood. Um, and so I think it's a huge piece, but I think allowing yourself to feel all the things you feel about that and to miss your old self. We kind of only give ourselves permission in our culture to grieve a death.
Yes.
But this is the death of your old self.
Yeah.
And so, and I think allowing yourself to feel that, to honor that, to metabolize that grief, is what's necessary. I always say you can't do the growth without the grief. You cannot get to this place that we're talking about of empowered and embodied motherhood until you fully process what it is to no longer be who you were.
Oh, I love that. You can't do the growth without the grief.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think it would just be great for us to remind everybody that in that process of holding space as best you can for that grief, of that acknowledgement that you aren't who you used to be and you never will be again, that doesn't take away from the joy or celebration or gratitude of motherhood. I know you would have seen this so often too, Jessie, but the mothers that I would support would feel bad that they're
Mhm.
grieving while also being incredibly grateful and falling deeply in love with their child.
Mhm.
Eventually, it takes a while sometimes. It did for me. But we can
Mhm.
hold, like we've said a number of times in this interview, the two truths, the paradox of grieving what we've lost while also being incredibly present and grateful for what we're receiving. And that also is something that we're not taught how to do. We're so binary, we're so black or white, and that it's okay to feel both in this process. In fact, we need to.
Totally. I think naming that is just everything.
Yeah.
Because when people can see their experiences of that full range of emotion reflected
Mm-hmm.
in you and I saying, oh my goodness, I'm still learning. And yes, that happened to me too. And it took me a while to fall in love with my child. And all of the things, I think when mothers see that reflected, it gives them a huge permission slip to feel the same way.
Yeah, huge permission slip. It's so good to catch up with you again. We need to do this more often. It's just wonderful to
Yeah.
be in a space with someone who is as geeked out about matrescence as I have been for this long.
Oh, yes, my friend. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on your book that's out in November. I know it's been a labour of love for 5 years.
Mhm.
Yeah, what a gift to the world this will be. I will share all of the details of your work, both with mothers but also with practitioners, in the show notes as well. Let's do this again soon.
Thank you so much, Amy. This has been great.
Thanks, as always, for being a part of our global Matrescence community. Please take a moment and make sure you're subscribed to this podcast in your podcast player so you can always be notified of our next episode. And if you would like to work with a coach on your own experience of matrescence, please go to mummarising.net and explore our directory of phenomenal coaches, workshop leaders, space holders and facilitators around the globe. You can also explore our Global Matrescence Foundation and consider donating so a mama in need can access the support of one of our coaches and still ensure that our coaches receive the income and support they need so they can continue to work in this way. And finally, if you would like to be a coach, a facilitator, and a matrescence activist in your own community, jump on our waitlist for our next intake of the Mama Rising Facilitator Training at mummarising.net. Thank you for being here and being part of this movement. Until next week, bye.